Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about institutional critique and research. On this episode, I am joined by the architect, urbanist, and teacher Ippolito Pestellini Laparelli. Ippolito is the curator of the Russian Pavilion at the 2020 Venice Biennale, and earlier this year he established his own studio, 2050 Plus, that operates at the intersection of technology, politics, the environment, and design. Before starting 2050 Plus, Ippo worked at OMA from 2007 to 2020 and was a partner there since 2014. Ippo and I begin this conversation talking about the ideas behind the Russian Pavilion. The 2020 Venice Biennale theme is how we live together, and I was curious how Ippo approached this theme and how it evolved now that it's become an entirely virtual pavilion, kind of rethinking what it means to live together. And so what they've done is they've created a really interesting fully online exhibition that features films and video games and podcasts and essays and projects. But the core ideas remain the same. He's still very interested in using this exhibition and using the Russian Pavilion as a form of institutional critique and in thinking about the structures of biennials themselves. We also talk about his time at OMA and how his work there, and specifically with their research arm, AMO, influenced his practice. I was really interested in the role of research in his work and how he moves between kind of various disciplines and various ideas. It's a really fun conversation, and one that I think really starts to get into these ideas of blending the theoretical with the commercial and kind of those sometimes competing desires within one practice. I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did. Remember that Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it and see it continue, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that is written by me and includes previews of the upcoming episodes, bonus content, exclusive interviews, and all sorts of other kind of interesting links and ideas. If you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me, and it really helps keep the podcast going. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you for listening, and here is my conversation with Ippolito Pestellini Laparelli. The theme of this year's Venice Biennale is how we live together, which since that was announced and the world that we live in now, I feel like that theme has taken on new meaning. Yeah. And I'm interested in, when you were appointed curator of the Russian Pavilion, how you initially interpreted that theme, how we live together, and how that has changed for you now that the entire Biennale has been postponed and you've moved the Russian Pavilion online. How has your thinking around this theme and this topic changed?
Well, I mean, the project that we initiated before the whole pandemia basically blocked us was actually a reflection on the institution of a national pavilion itself. So this was for Russia a year of transition, the first time with a new commissioner, the first time with basically a new institutional setup taking care of the pavilion, of the appointment of the curators, of the artists, and so on. So it became really a reflection on the pavilion as a sort of temporary institution. And we took it like that. Actually, the project had at the beginning two sides. One, an actual reconstruction of the architecture, which is quite damaged. And on the other side, an actual reconstruction of the institution itself. And when we were kind of investigating this topic, we thought, okay, I mean, the point is that the biennial, as an international cultural event, through the years, has become a stage for, let's say, market-oriented dynamics. So basically dominated by the gallery system in the case of the Biennial of Art, and dominated by a certain, amount of resources that some countries have as opposed to others. Most importantly, the Biennial has lost its connection to not just the international audience, but the city of Venice itself. In the 1970s, when Vittorio Gregotti was the head of the visual arts department, the discussion around the biennial were completely osmotic or in symbiosis, so to say, with the discussion about the future of Venice. So the biennial was a way to initiate a cultural platform of exchange that would also reflect not just in terms of artistic content and speculation, but also on the place where the biennial was actually sitting. And this has been lost through time in a way. And our reflection started from this idea of how to basically turn the pavilion from an empty shell that is filled every 2 years with new content into something basically that could have a longer time plan, so beyond the horizon of the 2 year cycle, starting from a reconstruction really of the institution of the pavilion. So imagining really how it could work in terms of mechanics, how to turn it into something that would not just host an exhibition, but a sort of work in progress. And in the case of our project at the beginning was actually supposed to really stage the reconstruction, the physical reconstruction of the pavilion with a very intense public program that would reflect on the condition of cultural institutions in times of global crisis. So that was the core. And then obviously the pandemic happened.
Right.
And we were kind of stuck and we could not do any longer the actual physical reconstruction. The biennial was postponed and we went through weeks of crisis, so to say. At one point,
Yeah.
at one point, we said, okay, but I mean, like what we are experiencing is not really social distancing, but rather physical distancing. I think the
Right.
whole
Right.
narrative about social distancing is it's strange because in a way we sort of transferred or migrated online, at least some of us,
Right.
to maintain our social relationship as intact as possible, so to say. So we decided at one point to basically take the whole project online, not really with the intention to fall into this kind of obsession for online events and so on, but really to test, like to test a kind of a different curatorial format, to test a different kind of environment, and to unpack what was supposed to be an exhibition, a public program into a sort of editorial and research platform. So, in a way, what happened is that now the project is ongoing. There is a program of events and content that is deployed on the platform every week. We don't have deliberately live events, not to fall into this kind of streaming bulimia, which was really
Yeah.
intense at the beginning of the
Yeah.
lockdown. And for us, I mean, paradoxically, the fact that we migrated online allowed the project to be much more elastic, and we could involve more components, more people, more voices. So it became really a sort of temporary platform for exchange. And um, I don't know whether it's really successful or not, but I think it really benefited the project to build a kind of stronger foundation simply by having more time and by being able to involve more people. So it became even more inclusive than
Right.
what we had originally planned if the biennial would have happened in May 2020.
Right. I mean, it's interesting too because the original kind of plan or the original kind of programming that you're talking about was so space specific.
Absolutely.
It was taking place at the pavilion. It was rethinking the pavilion. It was about the pavilion in a way. It was this kind of
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
totally.
meta project. And now without that space, it's interesting to think about without the physical space. It's interesting to think about how do you take those ideas and move them online and make it uh, still. I don't know the word I'm wanting to use is relevant, but that's not really what I mean. For someone like myself who has never been to Russia and would not have seen the pavilion, that I can encounter it and still kind of think about the ideas that you're thinking about.
Mm.
How did you think about translating these ideas that were so space specific to something that was now decidedly not physical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that, of course, it's a very interesting and crucial question. I mean, maybe going a couple of steps back. For us, and that's also part of my appointment as curator, the issue of national identity was not
Mm-hmm.
really central. I mean, not as central maybe as in previous editions. A pavilion
Mm-hmm.
basically stages a process and content and certain questions, which are, in this case specifically, relevant for the country. The question of institutions, it's definitely relevant in the Russian context, but also relevant in general. For us, the
Mm-hmm.
point was to basically to start from, a redefinition of the institution of the pavilion as a way to discuss institutions in general. Now, the translation basically on the online platform produced two shifts. First, the architectural project had to be told or narrated in a different way. So we have regular dispatches coming from the designers, which won the open call back in November.
Mm-hmm.
But then what became really central was the public program and all the projects associated to this public program, which were supposed to populate the physical institution in the
Right.
original plan. And those were able to be translated into a sort of editorial format. So, for example, we decided not to create a platform that would be too complicated in terms of design, not
Mm-hmm.
three-dimensional. So space in itself, in its original configuration, only appears in a video game that we released a couple of weeks back. That's the only moment where you actually experience space as such. You experience it through the medium of a video game, because video games are incredibly powerful social gathering environments. Maybe not for my generation, but definitely for the generation coming after me, before me, sorry. Um, all the contributions related to these questions of institutions, we simply unpack those through a longer period of time. So it's like taking an exhibition and transform it into a calendar of events, where the only, let's say, three-dimensional surrogate of the pavilion is in a video game, which reflects
Right.
obviously on our presence online and our presence in digital activities. And the rest has turned into a quasi magazine of sorts,
Right.
so to say. Um, from a curatorial perspective, I think that obviously, nothing can replace physical experience, and nothing can replace the fact that we can meet with our bodies in an architectural project or inside architecture. But at the same time, I think the shift online made clear these questions about the present and future of institutions, because we could give to this question more space through the screening program, through the Voices program, which is a series of contribution of people talking about this, and through the two games which we have released on the platform. So, of course, the experience is different, but to me, it was a way to actually let this question grow and let this question grow into other formats.
I find this so interesting, and this perhaps is just I might just be asking the same question in a different way. I'm not I'm not totally sure, but I find this idea that institutional critique or kind of critique of these systems can be and is an architectural project.
Absolutely.
And you've talked about before in other interviews talking about the pavilion and about your work generally about architecture and architects being kind of mediators of space. And I would love to hear more about how you think about this as a architecture project specifically, that architecture can play a role in this kind of institutional critique.
Abandoning the, let's say, not necessarily about the online platform, so more in general,
Yeah, and I mean,
or
kind of how
both,
you were
or
thinking of,
both. Yeah,
yeah, both. I mean, I
yeah,
think, I mean, I guess I'll just kind of show you my cards here in asking that question. I'm very interested in the expanding definitions of architecture and the expanding definitions of design, and
hmm
me coming from a graphic design, how these terms are much more elastic than we sometimes give them
hmm
credit. And so I'm I agree with you that institutional critique, both in a physical environment and online, can be and is an architecture project. And I'm interested in how you think about that and how you think about the role of architecture, whether that's physical or online.
Well, I mean, I think there are two. When you refer to the word itself, architecture is used in many contexts. Architecture is mostly about a set of relationships. It's about orchestrating relationship in space. In space, it's an extremely elastic definition. You can apply space in our three-dimensional environment, but you can use space to describe a book,
Mm-hmm.
to describe a political process, to describe a political assembly, to describe a video game environment, and so forth. So, as long as, let's say, we have the tools or the intention, the ambition to actually orchestrate this, let's say, definition space that
Mm-hmm.
falls into different kind of environments, I think an architect is always relevant in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Very often when I joined OMA, I remember I had a discussion with Rem about the power of cinema in terms of storytelling and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
fictionalization and so forth. And he said something very powerful that really stick to me, and I think it really enforced my practice for the years after that. That basically cinema is about the orchestration of scenes, and that's why
Right.
it's exactly a process that is, in its essence, very similar to what an architect does. An architect thinks in terms of an orchestration of spaces, which are stages for social interaction. And the way we intend social interactions today is very different because, of course, we have access to digital environments, we have access to different kind of editorial projects, we have access, of course, to different kind of physical spaces and so on. But I think the domain of the architect in that sense is really the design of that form of orchestration.
Right.
And that's why I think, for example, I come from Italy. Italy is living a sort of construction crisis since 50 years. Architects don't build in Italy,
Mm.
and they have not been building for a long time. That's why in the 60s and the 70s they produced, Italian architectural culture produced the radicals, collectives which were really involved in understanding architecture beyond its disciplinary boundaries, thinking about technology and media and communications and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, I never had the ambition, even as a student, to really go out there and design buildings. But
Mm.
I had the ambition basically to use spatial approach, or to actually to specialize different kind of problems in different kind of environments. And there, I think an architect has always a kind of role. Now, going back to your questions about institutional critique, of course, there is basically relationship. Even when you think about, in the most traditional sense about architecture, I go back to the example of the Russian Pavilion. The Russian Pavilion basically, in the past 30 or 40 years, went through a process of, you might say, bunkering. In a way, it became this kind of extremely closed box, almost like a metaphor in a way of the inaccessibility of the political system that you have in Russia, or the opacity of it.
Yeah.
And what we're doing actually is to start from that opacity, dismantling piece by piece, which means
Right.
basically the building will act in a completely different way. It will be more porous, more connected to the fragile ecosystem of Venice and its environment, more connected to the outside of the biennial. And by doing that, through actual and physical architectural operations, we are changing the way the institution that runs the pavilion can actually operate. So that's where really the point of interference is actually really through the project. But sometimes the
Right.
same kind of project, I think, can be applied again to a digital environment, to a game, or to an editorial, effort.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that completely. And I think you're exactly right. And I love that you brought up that quote from Rem when you first started at OMA. And I was very interested in this idea of scenography
Mm.
and staging, which you seem to talk about a lot. And I think that at first glance seems very clear when you are curating an exhibition, when you are designing a fashion show for
Mm.
Prada, but perhaps is less clear on the more building architectural side. But that is also a way of kind of creating these stages, which then is, uh, you know, creating how an institution functions, the way the space itself is actually designed. And I think that doesn't have to be physical. Like you said, that can be a video, that can be a video game, a film, it could be an audio podcast like this.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in where your interest in working across mediums came from, because
Mm.
I think obviously the pavilion is very multimedia driven.
Mm.
I think your work at OMA was very multimedia driven, kind of working across scales in media. And I think OMA in general thinks about that. And I saw that even before OMA, you were kind of working, designing video games and video clips and things like that. So you've
Yeah.
always been kind of working this way.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, okay. Partially interest. I've been a huge fan of cinema and moving images in general.
Mm, mhm,
Long before I entered architecture school. I entered architecture school almost by chance, in a way. And at my time, the kind of education that we would got in Milan, I studied in Milan and then in the Netherlands, was very generalist. I
mm,
would be able to actually study architecture and disciplines related to architecture, but at the same time, I would be able also to engage with media and photography and so on. And I think that also was due to the fact that Milan, as a scene, had a connection between different domains of visual cultures, which is ingrained in the culture that Milan developed in the 20th century. Think about,
mm.
for example, what the Memphis group used to do,
Right.
or the designers that were working across scales between fashion, objects, architecture, and media. Figures like Andrea Branzi or Lucio
Mm, mm.
or Ugo La Pietra, they were completely transdisciplinary. So I come from that culture. The city has an understanding of design which is absolutely multidimensional. Yeah, so that's one point.
Right.
And it is true, before joining OMA, I worked for a multimedia company where we used to work for MTV, running video
Mm,
clips and animations and so on. So it's something that always had triggered my interest. Also, because I never thought, like I said, that, let's say, the market would have given me the opportunity to actually act as an architect. And then I moved to the Netherlands and I sent this kind of letter to Oma and I said, look, this is what I do. Are
yeah.
you interested in me? And eventually, maybe it was the only large architecture
Yeah.
office which had a corner fully dedicated to transmedia,
Right.
transdisciplinary kind of engagements, and that was AMO. So when I entered in 2000, at the end of 2006, 2000, at the beginning of 2007, I entered in that domain, and that was my corner since then.
Mm.
I've always been kind of making the journey between a more traditional way of understanding architecture and practicing architecture and one which was definitely non-classical, non-traditional.
Right, right. That's a nice way to
Yeah.
put it. And I'm interested. I would like to talk about Ome and Ammo, and perhaps how that has influenced your new studio 2050 plus, and kind of how you are thinking about your work now.
Mhm.
I guess it was probably 2 years ago, I had Rainier de Graaf on the
Mm.
show,
Mhm.
um, shortly after his book came out, and I asked him about how he describes Ammo, and I don't mean to put down his answer. It was a good answer, but I'm still not totally clear on on what it is and how it relates to the larger umbrella of OMA. Can you talk about that? And the reason I'm asking you that is because I think, similar to Rainier, you also are someone who was kind of moving between them, like you said, in this kind of transdisciplinary space, but also in something that's a little bit more classical. How did you see that relationship?
Well, This is the most difficult question you could ever
I
ask.
know. I'm
There
sorry.
is
I'm
no
sorry.
one who can define what emo is, because emo
I think that's kind of the point too.
that's exactly the point. So, um, I think emo did something quite revolutionary when it was established because it was the first attempt to queer disciplines.
Mm, mm,
Something that is really happening right now. They became almost mainstream
hmm.
15 years later. It
Yeah.
was done then for the first time, really querying disciplines, like acting across at the intersection of multiple kind of knowledge fields. Um, like when first of all, there are multiple definitions of emo because there have been multiple people working in emo. So my
Right.
understanding of emo is probably very different from the understanding of Rainier, and that's
Yeah.
specifically because we belong to two different generations.
Right.
The way I've always seen, let's say, emo was basically a way to set the agenda of the whole company, but not
Mhm.
starting from the architectural opportunities provided by the market. So instead of
Right.
being passive to commissions coming to you, and of course that's very common for an architecture office of the size and status of OMA, you could actually say, okay, this is what's going on in the world. This is what is interesting for us to investigate. These are the disciplines we need to engage with to understand this phenomenon. And this is the way potentially these interests can become architectural projects. So I think and in 2010, I co-curated Chronochaos with Rem,
Right.
and Chronochaos was maybe a good example of this attitude because it was the moment in which OMA almost officially engaged into and systematically engaged in preservation projects. But because before doing that, we had to basically build our speculative position about preservation in general as a kind of a political and cultural phenomenon. And the same thing happened with countryside now,
Right.
and there will be actual project coming out of that. So AMO for me has been a way to set a precise research and intellectual agenda within the office, and in a much smaller scale, and maybe exploring more formats and more media. That's what I'm trying to do now in my new agency.
Yeah. And that's that kind of intersection or separation is what's really interesting to me. Both, I mean, OMA and AMO have had a profound influence on the way I think about my practice as a graphic designer. And you, in an interview talking about 2050 plus, described this intersection also, and you said that you see the new agency as I'm going to quote back something that you said, the separation between those that work primarily in a theoretical or speculative environment
Mm,
and remain kind of really niche because they can't enter the market, and the studios that work exclusively on commercial projects, the area in between hasn't been explored much, and that's where your interest is. And that's where my interest is
excellent.
also. um, I as much as I would love to be primarily or to be 100% in the theoretical and speculative environment and not deal with the market, that's just not financially or commercially possible or sustainable. And I'm interested in how they influence each other and
Mm.
how they talk to each other. And could you talk a bit about that, about how the research agendas, how the theoretical or kind of speculative projects actually then influence the I don't want to say real
No,
projects,
but
but you know what I
and
mean?
of course, yeah,
The market
commissions.
commercial
Yeah, of
projects. Yeah.
course, yeah. Well, things are not as linear as they are when you actually
Yeah.
describe them or fictionalize them. But to be completely clear, and um, I just give you an example that I think it's maybe a good way to explain this. Um, a couple of weeks back, we released a short film essay called Riders, Not Heroes,
Mhm.
that basically was looking at the condition of food delivery riders as essential workers during the lockdown in Milan. And it was looking basically at riders at the intersection between platform capitalism, gig labor, COVID-19, obviously, and the refugee crisis, because that plays a huge role in the way undocumented migrants are actually exploited by tech corporations in Italy, in Southern Europe. This project actually is a project that is connected in a way to a project that Nike commissioned us
Mm.
on Milan, on new forms of urban movement. So at one point, Nike Milan came to us and said, we really need to understand what is the future of sport here and whether we can use sport even as a word in the future.
Mm. Mm.
How competitiveness has changed. Who are the new movers across the city? And then I told them, like the point is to look beyond the definition of sports, but also to look beyond the definition of athletics. You have to look for people who
Right.
move across the city because of other reasons. People who are actually a conundrum of other problematics or issues or transformations. So we made a sort of map of the main trends of Milan. So changing population, aging population, pollution, climate change, the plans that the city is actually taking against this kind of phenomenon. And we sort of found movers that would be able to embody those transformations. So riders were ones, obviously, food
Hmm.
delivery riders, and they are in many cases athletes by all definitions. People who actually ride their bike for 100 kilometers every day. So it's a huge and enormous bodily effort. But also we look for this community that is called arbonauts, who are people who practice as a sport the climbing of trees.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's very beautiful because now they are used by the city to maintain the monumental trees in the city. And this is
Mm.
interesting in a city like Milan that has a very negative projection in terms of climate change. So by 2050, Milan should have plus 4 degrees. And the city has launched this plan of planting 3 million trees by then. So to look at the Arbonauts seem to look at the right community to actually understand this phenomenon. So we try to basically, match city dynamics with new movers. And somehow this conversation with Nike was really positive, and it started actually from the conversation on the riders. So that's a
Mm.
kind of example of how the two things have suddenly aligned, a more speculative dimension. We did that movie just for research intentions. It was
Right.
connected, obviously, to something that I do at the Royal College of Arts in terms of research in my studio, but it became almost naturally a project that a company that is trying to look critically at itself wanted to initiate.
That's interesting to me for a couple reasons. I'm going to try to form a question out of a bunch of stuff that you just said that I'm not totally sure I can articulate. Because I want to connect a couple things that you've said throughout this conversation. Earlier you mentioned even when you were studying architecture, you weren't sure you had a kind of strong desire to actually build. And I am someone who is kind of constantly thinking about terms and titles, and what can we call design, what can we call
Hmm.
architecture, can this be design, can this be architecture? And I'm looking at the now online version of the Russian Pavilion, and I'm thinking, sure, this is architecture, but also this is graphic design. Are
Absolutely.
those the
Yeah,
same?
yeah,
How do those start to talk to each other? And it's interesting hearing that with the Nike project, thinking about, well, what is sport? What is movement? How do these things kind of fit together?
yeah.
Do you have thoughts on, I guess, these terms, these kind of disciplinary boundaries now? Does it matter, or do you even think about whether something is architecture or not? Is it all architecture? Does that even matter how we define it? What do you think about all this? Because you're someone who's kind of, all over the place. You're making films and exhibitions and
Yeah.
buildings. Is that all the same for you?
No, it's not the same, but I do have a very expansive notion of architecture. So maybe I don't have a disciplinary notion of architecture. It's a really good question, and I don't want to be limited by definitions. That's
Yeah, right.
my main problem. I had this problem all my life. all my life.
That's it.
Like, and then people try to put you in a place, and then then they realize actually that's not really the right place. Then they put you into another place, and then they realize actually that's not really the right place where it should be. And somehow I had found my dimension in this kind of in between spaces.
Right.
Before I was mentioned, I said, okay, it's true that I work for AMO, but for a long time. But at one point, we were able to create a corner in the office that was actually really sitting between AMO and OMA,
Mm.
between the built and the unbuilt. It was not. It was neither one. That was my corner in a way. And I know that that sounds a little bit strange, but I do think that through architectural thinking you can actually um, project a certain framework, a certain approach into many fields. I mean, the project of Nike is a project on the city essentially,
Mm.
and
Mm.
how the
Mhm.
city is basically changing under these dynamics, and how movement is actually being affected by these dynamics. You can call it sport, I don't know. You can call it city transformation, I don't know. I think things are then at one point self-evident, and I do understand that people that work a lot with language normally tend to give definitions that actually are really important to clarify what is the ambition of a project or what is the ambition of an editorial program and so forth. But to me, that's really I don't want to say secondary, but it comes a little bit after in a way. What I'm interested in is to build narratives. I
Right.
want to create stories. The way I do stories, it's through a certain understanding of space. Then if this basically materializes in an online editorial project, a video game, or a movie, it's really a consequence of the story that I want to say, that I want to tell.
Right. Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's a great way to think about it, because I've often thought about as a designer that my primary interest is in the form of the content itself, not in whether it's, typographic or whatever we kind of
Absolutely,
define.
exactly, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I think that's it's almost like a modernist way of see things, and that's to me not any longer. I don't want to say relevant, but efficient. We need more
Yeah.
complexity to basically tell this crazy world we are living in.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had the chance to look at the let's play event of the movie, let's play event video that
Yeah. Yeah.
presents.
Yeah.
At one point, this geographer who is in conversation with the game designer says something that for me is hilarious, because he says, "Ah, well, we are in the Russian Pavilion, and then the Giardini are dominated by crazy bots and crazy robots, and there is a virus, and there is a nuclear bomb outside of the pavilion." Well, it's actually really
Right.
like real life.
Right.
So how do you tell that? How can you basically simplify a condition that is so insanely layered and complex? So I think I think there is, on one side, there is a need to define things, and on the other side there is a need to actually explain processes which are too quick and too complex to be actually defined, to fall
Right.
under certain definitions.
Can I ask you that same question from kind of another
Sure.
angle? Because you mentioned your research with the Royal College of Art, and
Yeah.
you've taught, for almost as long as you've been kind of practicing, kind of in parallel, it seems like. How does teaching fit into that, and how do these ideas, or in these kind of these things we're talking about, of kind of rethinking these definitions, or that these definitions don't even matter, how does that translate in the classroom for you, and in the kind of research that you're doing with students?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I mean, there is really a sort of osmotic kind of relationship between practice and research and or pedagogy, you might say. I mean, the fact is, I teach now at the Royal College of Arts, and the Royal College of Arts is an extremely experimental school under many perspectives. Architecture is embedded within multiple other departments: fashion, ceramics, media, and so on. So it's sort of they all feed into each other. So we have sometimes an art, sometimes we are not really able to, uh, you know, again, to define architectural the project that our students develop, because they are not under classic definitions. I mean, there is always a connection. The studio that we run the studio that we run at the Royal College of Arts is called Data Matter. So it looks basically at the connection between data and the physical world, how the two domains are entangled, and from a material perspective, but also from a political, or in the case of the movie about the writers, from a labor perspective, So, and those are some of the topics that are really crucial in our understanding and research methodology at the Royal College of Arts, and they somehow spill out very often into practice. I must say that in the last year, the college for me has been really an engine of research and investigation. And I try to, in a way, bring a lot of the things that I do at college into actual practice whenever I could, even in the way that we sort of generate output about our projects, what kind of media we use. We have an enormous and incredible access to extremely sophisticated softwares at college, robotics departments, and so on. So that is something that is in a way shaping a new kind of architects, and in a way the studio is really our agency is really getting a lot of, yeah, I mean, it's getting in a way richer by keeping this connection alive. Like many things have changed. You said before, I've been teaching in parallel in different universities, and somehow things have changed a lot, and they are changing much faster in the past years. Like for example, like when I was working on Manifesta had, of course, a lot to do with, maybe with topics and things which are connected to the revolution of the Anthropocene, and what that really led in the way that we teach at school is the explosion of the scale of references. Before, like until a few years ago, architects would think in architectural scales from one to
Right.
one to 1 to 10,000, 100,000 maybe. But those were in a way the range. Now, in a way, we look from chemical reactions to planetary systems. And
Right.
that's crazy and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
schizophrenic, but in order to do that, we need to rely on conversations with other experts, with other disciplines all the time, and find our role in those kind of new domains. And that makes this moment super, super exciting. I think there are really a lot of opportunities because of those conversations.
That leads into my kind of final two questions that I use to end all of these conversations. I'm curious what you're thinking about now. What's next for you? What's next for the agency? What are the kind of research topics that are getting you really excited right now?
Well, I mean, we as a sort of an agenda, we decided to work within this, let's say, at the intersection between technology, politics, design, of course, and environmental practices. And
Mhm,
what we are
mhm.
trying to understand basically is, most importantly, how anything that, I mean, I didn't explain this well actually, but we are trying to position ourselves always within these four kind of domains,
Mm,
and somehow this it's important both for our research project but also for our, let's call them, commercial project. That means basically that when we do speculative projects, we have the freedom to investigate these four domains or their connections, of course, the way we want. We curate ourselves and we curate the projects. But it's extremely interesting how the conversations with clients are actually going once we bring up these topics.
mhm,
And
mhm.
it seems that, for example, a lot of the projects that we're starting now will be developed through this filter. So even if they're commercial, even if they are coming from completely different domains for completely other reasons, somehow this kind of attitude is, or this kind of domains, it almost works like a filter so that we can understand or frame our project, whether they are architectural or non-architectural, through these areas of interest. And that's the way we're trying to curate the agency in general, so that we have the freedom with the college, with our academic collaborations, or with our research projects to really investigate freely these topics, but also to bring them and to use them as a filter to, let's say, to approach more commercial work.
Right. So the research or speculative projects end up guiding
A lot.
what commercial
A
projects
lot.
you
I
decide to
mean,
take
of
on.
course, and I mean, obviously, with all the compromises that a commercial project entails. I mean, we know that, you
Right.
know that, it's nothing new, but at least we have something that we can discuss really at the beginning of the process, that we
Yeah.
somehow are able to master, to present, to narrate to our potential clients. And in a way, we are funding probably because of the moment, because I mean, obviously, I think we are actually facing a super exciting phase, because a lot of, let's call them commercial clients, are realizing that many things have to change, and many things have to
Right.
change with a different kind of awareness about environmental issues, about technology, about politics, and about design. And design in a
Right.
way is actually able to tie all these things up for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I interviewed a couple months ago Winka Doubledom, who's
Mm,
the chair of the architecture program at Penn,
yeah.
and I asked her a similar question that I asked you about kind of like how you define architecture, how you kind of define your practice, and she said um, that for her, architecture is just everything that she's interested in, which I've kind of borrowed for my definition of design, and I think you're exactly right. It's like this this glue that can tie everything together.
Mm. But like at one point, also really like thinking about, I don't know, the next generation of architects, or whatever you want to call it. For example, for me, the definition of architect is extremely limited, and somehow similar to other cases, other friends will like to maybe refer to ourselves more broadly as spatial practitioners,
Mm,
which has a much more elastic kind of definition, if you wish. And in the same way that we really discuss with our students, I mean, what we want to do, and maybe that's also where the agency is really going, is to be able to sit at those tables where architects normally are not present.
right.
Like
Right.
where you can bring your perspectives about, about in certain fields where normally you're simply not present, because your role is taken by either engineers or scientists, or sometimes policymakers and so on. So the point is to acquire enough transdisciplinary knowledge and attitude, not to lead a process, but to shape it together with other people. And that's exactly the key point that we are trying to develop, both in the agency, but also at school.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly right. My last question. This is the question that I use to end all of these conversations. Would just like to know what you're reading right now.
Oh, wow, that's really good. So the last book that I read is Oval. I don't know if you know it. It's by Elvia Wilk.
I
It's
don't know this.
Yeah, it's a nice book that takes in consideration, let's say, the climate crisis and real estate, and multiple forces which are now overlapping at the moment.
Oh, interesting.
And But through fiction,
Mm,
it's not really, how do you want to say it? Uh, it's not too speculative. It's just a nice book to read in a way. So that's the book that I'm reading now, and then the book that I read just before this one, I think it's yeah, it's a classic one. It's Beat Rot by Douglas Coupland.
oh,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah,
I,
yeah.
oh, I haven't read. That's been on my list for years.
Yeah. It's good.
Yeah, I'll have to add both those. And that other one that you mentioned, I'm not familiar with, but sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
That's great. Ippo, this was such an interesting conversation for me. I really like the way that you think about these things and the way you think about your work. I'm a fan. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Jarrett, and it was really nice to talk to you. And also very nice, conversational, very nice. Thank you. It's been very, you've been very welcoming, so to say.
This episode was recorded on July 17th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.